The prophecy of the restoration of Jerusalem is a significant and intricate theme in biblical texts, encompassing spiritual, historical, and eschatological dimensions. Throughout the Old Testament, especially in the writings of Isaiah, Ezekiel, and Zechariah, this concept is depicted as a powerful promise from God to restore the city of Jerusalem, both physically and spiritually, after times of devastation, exile, and destruction. Exile and destruction. At the heart of these prophecies is the promise of God's favor returning to Jerusalem and the Jewish people. Historically, this would have been a reassuring message to the Israelites, especially during the period of Babylonian exile when the fate of the city seemed bleak. The restoration, however, was not just about rebuilding walls or a temple. It represented a restoration of the relationship between God and His people, a return to faith and righteousness, and the re-establishment of the city as a beacon for all nations. In the book of Isaiah, the prophecy about Jerusalem's restoration takes on a dual meaning. On one level, it addresses the immediate hope of the return of the exiled Israelites to their homeland. On another, it has a messianic implication, referring to a time when peace will reign and God's justice will be evident. Isaiah paints a picture of a city that will no longer be desecrated, but instead it will shine as a symbol of hope, justice, and salvation. For instance, in Isaiah 60, the prophet speaks of nations and kings coming to Jerusalem to bring tribute and honor to God. This vision is not just of physical restoration, but a spiritual awakening that would bring people from all nations to recognize the glory of God. Ezekiel's visions also provide a vivid portrayal of the restoration of Jerusalem. His imagery is particularly strong in his descriptions of the new temple, which symbolizes the return of God's presence among His people. Ezekiel's prophecy speaks of a renewed covenant between God and Israel, where the people will once again follow God's laws and live in peace. The temple is described as a place where God's glory will dwell, and the city will be a place of righteousness and prosperity. This vision is seen as a metaphorical restoration that goes beyond the physical rebuilding of the city to encompass a deeper spiritual renewal. Ezekiel's vision of the dry bones coming to life in chapter 37 is another powerful image of restoration, signifying that God will breathe new life into His people, just as He did for the dead bones. Zechariah's prophecy, like Isaiah and Ezekiel's, emphasizes both physical and spiritual restoration. In Zechariah 8, the prophet speaks of a time when Jerusalem will be a city of peace, filled with the elderly and children, where people from all over the world will come to worship God. Zechariah also foretells a time when Israel's enemies will be defeated, and God's favor will be restored to the city. He emphasizes the importance of Jerusalem as the center of worship and a place where God's glory will be manifested. The concept of the restoration of Jerusalem is not only a promise for the immediate future of the Jewish people, but also serves as a symbol of hope for all believers in the ultimate fulfillment of God's kingdom. In Christian theology, these prophecies are often interpreted as being fulfilled in part through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Many Christians see the prophecies of Jerusalem's restoration as pointing to the establishment of Christ's eternal kingdom, where peace and righteousness will reign forever. The book of Revelation, for example, echoes these themes, particularly in its vision of the New Jerusalem, a city where God will dwell with His people in the final, eternal state. The restoration of Jerusalem is thus not just a historical or future event. It is deeply tied to the spiritual themes of redemption, renewal, and reconciliation between God and His people. For the Jewish people, it has been a long-standing hope, a prayerful longing for the return to the land promised to their ancestors, and the re-establishment of their holy city. Throughout history, this prophecy has inspired countless generations, motivating hope even during times of exile, persecution, and suffering. In modern times, the restoration of Jerusalem has taken on additional significance. The establishment of the modern state of Israel in 1948 is often viewed by some as a fulfillment of biblical prophecies, though there is ongoing debate among scholars and theologians about the full extent of these fulfillments. For many Jews, the return to Jerusalem and the rebuilding of the city's infrastructure is seen as part of the divine plan of restoration. For Christians, the physical restoration of the city is viewed as a precursor to the ultimate spiritual restoration that will occur at the end of time when Christ returns and establishes His kingdom. However, the prophecy of Jerusalem's restoration is not limited to physical or political restoration alone. The essence of these prophecies is spiritual renewal, the prophets emphasize that the people of Jerusalem and Israel must return to God, forsaking idolatry, sin, and injustice. The restoration of the city is inseparable from the people's repentance and return to righteous living. This is evident in the numerous calls for repentance and reform found throughout the prophetic books, which stress that the restoration of the city and the nation can only occur when the people's hearts are turned back to God. The role of Jerusalem as a center of worship and justice remains central to the prophetic vision. The restored Jerusalem is depicted as a place where God's law is followed and His will is done on earth as it is in heaven. It is a place of unity, where people from all nations and backgrounds come together to worship God in spirit and truth. This vision of Jerusalem transcends national or ethnic boundaries and becomes a symbol of God's desire for reconciliation, peace, and justice for all people. In conclusion, the prophecy of the restoration of Jerusalem is a multifaceted theme in biblical literature that encompasses historical, spiritual, and eschatological dimensions. It promises both a physical rebuilding of the city and a spiritual renewal of God's covenant with His people. The prophecies offer hope to the Jewish people, assurance of God's faithfulness, and a vision of peace and justice for all nations. These promises find fulfillment in both the immediate return of the Israelites from exile and in the broader eschatological hope for the coming of God's eternal kingdom. Through the restoration of Jerusalem, the prophets present a vision of a world where God's presence is known, His justice reigns, and His peace fills the earth.